Nigeria's President Bola Tinubu is calling for international cooperation to combat violent extremism in Africa. In his first speech at the UN General Assembly, Tinubu touted the need to prioritize Africa's development and foster mutually beneficial partnerships. State House correspondent Adesuwa Erediauwa reports.
The United Nations General Assembly debate commenced with Secretary General Guterres offering a frank assessment of the state of the world.
Our world is becoming unhinged. Geopolitical tensions are rising. Global challenges are mounting. And we seem incapable of coming together to respond. We confront a host of existential threats, from the climate crisis to disruptive technologies, and we do so at a time of chaotic transition.
World leaders took turns to highlight pressing global issues. Amidst this, Nigeria's Bola Tinubu listened to fellow leaders and engaged in sideline meetings, including discussions with King of Jordan and the President of Angola. After over 20 world leaders, Tinubu finally stepped onto the world's biggest diplomatic stage for his first address.
On behalf of the people of Nigeria,
President Tinubu highlights Africa's unique challenges rooted in a history of unfulfilled promises and exploitation. He urged global cooperation to support Africa's development.
Many proclamations have been made, yet our troubles remain close at hand. Failures in good governance have hindered Africa, but broken promises, unfair treatment, and outright exploitation from abroad have also exerted a heavy toll on our ability to progress. Given this long history, if this year's theme is to mean anything at all, it must mean something special and particular to Africa.
Tinubu commits to leading by example through reforms in Nigeria, accepting short-term hardships for long-term growth.
The question is not whether Nigeria is open for business. The question is how much of the world is truly open to doing business with Nigeria, and how African is an equal, mutually beneficial manner. Direct investment in critical industries, opening airports to a wider range and larger quantity of African exports, and meaningful debt relief are important aspects of the cooperation we seek.
On the issue of climate change, President Tinubu called for a fair, just, and firm commitment to Africa. He also challenged the ongoing exploitation of Africa's mineral-rich areas, including Nigeria, citing crimes perpetrated by foreign entities and aided by local criminals.
Given the extent of this injustice and the high scales involved, many Africans are asking whether the phenomenon is by accident or by design.
In his approximately 20-minute speech, President Tinubu concluded with a call for regional empowerment.
To the rest of the world, I say, work with us as true friends and partners. Africa is not a problem to be avoided, nor is it to be pitied. Africa is nothing less than the key to the world's future.
President Bola Tinubu's speech underscores that Africa's potentials and opportunities are global in scale. It is left to be seen how this speech inspires collaboration and efforts to unlock Africa's potential, leading to a better world for all. From the United Nations General Assembly, Adesuwa Erediauwa, Arise News.
Joining us now for a review of President Tinubu's address at the UN General Assembly is Dr. Adesuwa Erediauwa, Senior Research Fellow at the Nigerian Institute of International Affairs, NIIA. Good morning, Dr. Erediauwa.
Good morning,
to see
Doc.
you.
Thank you for having me.
Just as the intro indicated, what's your take on the President's speech, particularly with regard to the major highlights in that particular speech?
I found President Tinubu's speech very interesting and enlightening. I particularly liked the turn the speech took. Why? Because it was more focused on Africa and Nigeria. Of course, we know that the agenda for the General Assembly was a more global agenda, although security issues, it tends to focus more on Africa, but I like that President Tinubu focused on Africa, focused on Nigeria, with specifically on the crisis in the coup and the military regime in Niger. I also I found his speech very interesting because he was, as much as he focused on Africa, he was able to bring out. He was able to tout Nigeria as being prepared for the world, being prepared to receive investment, to collaborate more on a more equitable, in a more equitable manner. I thought that was very interesting. I also thought that it was interesting and very important, his comments on climate change issues and how that Nigeria could use it as an opportunity, not just to curb climate change in Nigeria, but take economic advantage of the efforts at protecting the environment. Yes.
All right. Okay. Thank you very much. I mean, just spotlighted some of the key areas which he touched on during his speech yesterday. Adesuwa signed off with a very important line with regards to it would now be left to see if his speech, even though it's been adjudged, good in terms of, what he said, the tone of what he said, what he addressed, and, just positioning Nigeria and Africa in terms of being trade partners to our international community, would it inspire investment? Because at the end of the day, if he's saying that Nigeria is open for trade and, for mutually benefiting trade, in fact, is that enough? The strength of his words, or is there more that would need to be done to really bring in these investments and trade partners?
Surely there's more that would need to be done. But I think so far, the effort he has made is commendable. So aside from his statements at the assembly in his speech, aside from that, his body language, political body language, his recent visits to source investments, and then more importantly, which he also pointed out in the speech, the subsidy removal and the correction of the foreign exchange, disparities and all of that. I think those are vital signals to potential investors, to other countries, that Nigeria is likely ready to do business, ready to receive investment. But however, there is still a lot more to be done with regards to the investment climate. And when we are talking about investment climate, we're talking about security, or should I say insecurity issues. We're talking about the economy. I think there's more to be done with that in that regard.
Okay, so most of the reform he talked about has also brought very punishing hardship, on the people, as we know now that things are not the same again. Another aspect he talked about, and I'd like you to expatiate on the fact that we want to trade, it was pretty much, what are we going to give back in return to the West? How can we meet the West halfway in terms of trade? So it's not about just come and invest here. What are we also investing in the world? Can you talk through that?
So aside from the fact that, as he said in his speech, that Africa and Nigeria craves the support. He mentioned the Marshall Program. Africa and Nigeria craves the support of America, the West, so to speak, similar to the intensity with which they gave Europe after the Second World War. Apart from the Marshall Plan. Apart from that dimension, as if to say, with all that has gone on in Africa and Nigeria, as if to say, mildly put, that the West kind of owes us something
today.
Yes. So owes Africa something because of all the exploitation of the past, and also because of the exploitation, that same intensity, that same effort could be directed towards Africa and Nigeria in a sort of balanced manner. As, for example, if that effort could be channeled towards Europe, we're not less equal, we're not less important, the same effort to help stabilize the economy, because the goal of that plan was to stabilize Europe after the World War II. To answer the question, I think Africa has a lot to offer the West. It's not going to be an unbalanced, it has always been an unbalanced, unfair trade between Africa and the rest of the world. Now we're determining and we're saying it should be more equitable, because the West needs Africa for obvious reasons, access to needed, very vital raw materials, which they are already taking advantage of anyway, access to vast markets for their exports, for their products, access to labor, for relatively cheap labor for their businesses, which of course they want to expand and take advantage of economies of scale in production. So I think Africa and Nigeria has a lot to offer the West. Apart from the history of the unbalanced relationship, access to raw materials. We have the natural resources, agricultural products, minerals that is needed globally. We possess that in Africa. We have relatively, in Nigeria, for example, relatively cheap labor for investors to take advantage of. Yeah, so I think that we have...
Doctor, you were very right when you said the focus of this 78th UN General Assembly is global. And the focus is about accelerating action on the 2030 agenda, the SDGs, Social Development Goals, 17 goals, 169 targets. And the objective is to build solidarity and trust around all of this for the benefit of all, of ensuring peace, progress, and prosperity for everybody. Is that goal realizable, considering the fact that we've been on these SDGs for decades now? We've had different SDG progress reports. So do you think the world, as it is now, the state of geopolitics, that our objective of solidarity and trust can be achieved?
That's a really dicey one, because to be honest, the state of the world now, it seems as though it will be difficult to achieve that. First of all, what's the most glaring indicator is the attendance at the General Assembly. Only one of the P5 permanent members of the UN Security Council, the US, was present. That kind of spoke to some form of fragmentation, some form of division among the world powers. So I would say also with the security indicators, the crisis, the geopolitical conflicts, the food insecurity crisis, there's division in the world. And though it might be seeming as though that, especially the industrialized, the G7 nations, for example, by their attendance at the General Assembly, though it may seem as though there's no confidence or there's no trust, it is still possible. I'm really surprised at what you've observed, which is true, that there seems to be no cohesion or no trust or no solidarity. Why do I say I'm surprised? Because after the COVID-19 crisis, the pandemic, which was supposed to really bring the world to a level playing ground, you would think that the world countries will be more united. But apparently that may seem not to be the case. And the geopolitical conflict, especially among the separation of the global south from the north, and the drive for a multipolar world, which is noble, a multipolar order, which is noble on its own. But yes, it does seem to push the goals of solidarity and trust farther away. But I think it is possible. How I would say that it's possible because of the unity that the global south, or the global south nations, the developing nations, not necessarily the global south, developing nations tend to bond together there's more trust among the developing nations as it is now. And the developing nations are trying to forge a non-aligned stance. So I think Africa can champion a world where there is more solidarity and trust. Why? Because these so-called multipolar powers, each of them, however you want to group them, they are trying to forge relations with Africa. So it seems as though to them, Africa is the prize. So since there's
the last frontier.
Thank you. So since there's that struggle or scramble for Africa, it's the same Africa that will kind of cause there to be a cohesion of everyone together. I don't know how though, but that's what I think.
All right. Well, let me take you back to the SDGs because it's going to be one of the main focus of the United Nations General Assembly and the SDG Summit as well, because there's only 7 years left to achieve these goals. Started off as the Millennium Development Goals, wasn't quite achievable, and then expanded to be the SDGs. Let's look at Africa and Nigeria. We've received quite a bit of funding from the UN and commitments. We have an essay for SDGs. How well do you think we are to achieving that, and at what measure? So number one is no poverty. We talk about poverty levels in the nation. I mean, thankfully, this particular administration has given its commitment to ending poverty. That's one of its key focus areas. We see zero hunger. Let's not talk about food inflation and the fact that we have a state of emergency on hunger in Nigeria. Good health and well-being, huge challenge. Quality education, we can take a whole syllabus on that. Gender equality, clean, it doesn't look as if we've even begun to scratch the surface. From a Nigerian and African perspective, where do we move for? Is it working? Are we going to expand it again to maybe another DG, maybe 2050 or something? Where are we and how can we ramp up our position?
I certainly do hope that we can make progress in the 7 years that are left. Though speaking realistically, given the indicators, they won't disappear in 7 years. For example, we mentioned education, a large number, about 20 million, over 20 million of young children out of school and not out of school, not in school physically. And also the poverty, speaking of the poverty rates, recently with the subsidy removal, a large proportion of Nigerians have been moved into multidimensional poverty and also extreme poverty. About 133 million in multidimensional poverty and about 70 million in extreme poverty. So the indicators they're not looking good, they are grim.
So how do we ramp it up? How do we at least try to bridge the gap?
I personally think that the president, the current administration, is making efforts to do that. Although Mr. Rufai talked about the subsidy and the impacts on the people and the inflation rates pushing about 25% and all the hardships as a result of the subsidy. But I think that the drive that the president is on, the investment drive, is going to impact positively. For example, we're going to see if all the commitments to investment by the Indians and all the commitments, if they are to follow through, we will see a growth in the economy. Now, we see a growth, positive, not just positive growth rates, we see growth in the economy. Right. Now, the thing is for the president to commit to accompanying that with reducing the inequality gap.
All right.
For example, subsidy has been removed. The subsidy revenues can be channeled into areas that will improve well-being.
Okay.
Infrastructure development, education.
All right.
Skills acquisition, vocational technical skills for young people. We have a high demography of young people, and we're driving investment. So we need skilled workers who are going to work at this new drive for investment.
Absolutely.
So I think that there is hope, but maybe not in the medium term even. In the medium term, what I see happening is growth, positive growth race, economic growth. But what needs to be done is for the president to make deliberate moves to reduce the gap, the income gap, so that we no longer at least are the poverty capital of the world, and there's well-being for people.
This particular administration certainly has its work cut out for them, and I'm sure that hopefully deals will be struck at the United Nations General Assembly in New York. Thank you so much, Dr. Adesuwa Erediauwa, for your time with us this morning.